Memento Mori and Vanitas paintings, created by Abby Klaus, Aubrey Harold, and Megan Lovejoy. On the next slide, you will be presented with two paintings. One is a Memento Mori, and one is a Vanitas painting. You will try to guess which is which.
So we're going to look at what Memento Mori means and where it started. So the definition of Memento Mori is a Latin term for remember that you must die. Memento Mori paintings are made to emphasize the passage of time and how short life is. They serve as a reminder to make the best of the time that we have and that death is always around the corner. The history of Memento Mori starts around the late 1500s and the early 1600s, mostly used by Christians as a way to value eternal life rather than our earthly life.
Ever feel like you're immortal, with the strength of 1,000 suns, eternal, invincible? Yeah, me too. But guess what? There's a form of art that was intended to remind you constantly of your unavoidable, inevitable, permanent death. It's a memento mori, which in Latin means remember death, or if you want to take it more personally, remember that you must die. If you look at European memento mori paintings from medieval times until the 19th century, you might notice things like skulls, rotting fruit and flowers, the Grim Reaper, a deck of cards, hourglasses, more rotting fruit and flowers. These were elements that painters would include in a still life, a portrait, a biblical scene, to make sure you could not escape the fact that you are temporary, that one day your hourglass will run out of sand, and you too will rot and become a skeleton. Sweet, right? But it was a powerful tool to make people think about their mortality, and as a consequence, maybe live their lives a little bit better, be a better or kinder person, or at least have a moment where they put less emphasis on their possessions and their social status as a measure of their worth in the world. These works came from a Christian belief system, and the idea that if you were better, you'd be saved in the afterlife. And that might be why many of these memento mori showed up in art related to funerals. I mean, what better time to ruminate on your own death than when you're grieving for somebody else? And while the term memento mori itself hasn't been as common since Victorian England, we still see a ton of art that tries to communicate the same idea. The skulls you see in art from the Mexican Day of the Dead? Yeah, those are to remind you that you're going to kick the bucket. Lots of traditions, including Buddhism and Japanese Zen culture, still have artworks or poems that perform the same function. And contemporary artists do it too. In 2007, British artist Damien Hirst created a sculpture of a skull covered in over 8,000 diamonds. Pretty subtle reference. The Weeknd calls his new radio show Memento Mori. And in the last video before his death, Mac Miller carved the words Memento Mori into his own coffin.
Hell yeah. They letting me
Listen, it's not terrible to think of the fact that you're going to be gone one day, and maybe put more emphasis on your character than your car. Live kindly, compassionately, eat your vegetables, call your mom. Thanks for sticking with me through this morbid edition of Art 101. I'll be back soon with way less death. Hey, here's a picture of a puppy. It's also gonna die.
There are two main categories for common symbols in Memento Mori paintings. The first category, death and decay, was symbolized with skulls, wilted flowers, and rotting fruits. And the other was passage of time, which was symbolized with candles and hourglasses. The main goal of a Memento Mori painting is to remind the viewer that they are temporary, that life is short, so they must make the best use of their time and switch their focus from the temporary nature of Earth to the eternal life in store for them after they die. This painting by Giovanni Martinelli, Memento Mori, Death Comes to the Table, is a great example of what Memento Mori paintings were all about and has a lot of the common symbolism. Starting on the right, we see a skeleton. The skeleton represents death. In his hand is an hourglass, referring to the end of one's life. Right next to him is a man whose shocked expression, along with the other figure's shocked expressions, really should suggest how untimely and unexpected death can be. We also see how these figures are dressed in very nice clothing, like rich people's clothes, and how they have a full feast on the table. The fresh feast, as well as the clothing and furniture of the room, suggest or serve as reminders that what we have is temporary and will decay just like us. Finally, by placing death on the far right of the painting, the viewer is forced to read the painting from left to right, like a timeline. And at the end of the timeline, like all of our lives, is death.
Vanitas paintings is a genre of still life that stems from the Memento Mori tradition. These paintings usually contain a collection of items that represent death and remind the viewer of mortality. Vanitas became very popular around the early 17th century. The general purpose and message of Vanitas paintings is that life ends abruptly and permanently because of the inevitability of death. The artist usually wants to remind the viewer that earthly pleasures are temporary. On this slide, I included mottos that some Vanitas artists used for their paintings. Some common symbolism in Vanitas paintings include arts and sciences, wealth and power, eternal life, earthly pleasures, and death and transience. The most important symbols among these is eternal life, earthly pleasures, and death and transience. These symbols remind us that our body is constantly decaying and we will eventually die. This is a photo of a Vanitas painting that has many of the symbols I discussed in the last slide. On the right, you can see a king's crown and staff that represent wealth and power. The globe in the background and the letter in the front represent arts and sciences. The laurel plant in the front represents eternal life. The pocket watch in front represents the passing of time. The skull and candle in the middle and the soap bubbles floating above represent the inevitability of death. And lastly, the withering flowers represent that life is short. One unique part of this piece is the dead leaves that lay across the skull's forehead. I think this could possibly be suggesting the thorns that Jesus wore during the crucifixion.
So now we're going to mash together the Vanitas paintings and Memento Mori. As you can probably tell from the screen and from the past couple slides, the meanings between both are different, yet Vanitas are related to the earlier tradition of Memento Mori. The artworks intend to prompt viewers to consider the morality, and in addition to that, both interpret their paintings in almost the exact same way, yet have two completely different meanings depending on the artist. So how are Vanitas paintings and Memento Mori similar? They both have a common meaning within their works. They have a heavy relation to work about death. They have the same symbolism used, only it is only about one or two things. They both include skulls and candles a lot of the time, which is a big thing specifically to Memento Mori. Kind of both involve a similar practice, which it is interpreted that it is to help detach from worldly goods and luxuries. And a lot of Memento Mori and Vanitas paintings are both still life works. So for the differences between these, there's only two really big ones. One of them, even though I said that the symbolism is what makes them similar, it does make them similar, but also it's what makes them very different. The symbols that the Vanitas paintings have compared to Memento Mori paintings are different in a big way and can help you tell the difference between which is which. Memento Mori paintings often use skulls and extinguished candles, where vanitas paintings use large platters of rotten fruit, bubbles, which kind of have an interpretation of life or sudden death, smoke, watches, and hourglasses. The other one has to do with how each one is kind of invested in religion. A big one is Memento Mori has a bigger role within like Christianity. And on the next slide, there'll be more over that. Lastly, kind of to tie the differences together a little more, the tie that both have to religion is more definitely on the Memento Mori side, which has a particular tie to the Christian faith, but more on the side of Puritan worship. Whenever people used to go and have full worship spaces, there used to be Puritan worship spaces at one point that had stones that etched the words Memento Mori as a way for the Christian people to have a deeper tie with their loved ones who passed while still being connected in the church. Now this is found more on the way to a graveyard and even more so in paintings. Now also there's this theory that it has an important aspect for the disciplines within Memento Mori, as we talked about before, but in particularly Christianity. It provides inspiration to turn one's attention away from the distractions of earthly connections and desires and brings their focus on the prospect of afterlife.